I ran into this when I asked for suggestions on articles about audiobooks in a book group I'm a part of on Facebook. And somebody attacked me and said that my kid was cheating because she wasn't working as hard as the other kids if she listened to an audiobook, which is asinine. Asinine. So I just ended up deleting that whole thing and whatever. She can go live her happy little life with no audiobooks. Hi everyone, it's Lori, and I'm here today, and I want to talk to you about audiobooks. As you probably know, if you've watched very many of my videos at all, I'm a big proponent of audiobooks. I have several videos about recommended audiobooks, recommended narrators, and those sorts of things. I'm also very big into reading aloud. My kids are 14 and 12 right now, and we do still try to read aloud as regularly as possible with them, although it is a lot harder as they get older and busier. But I recently had a bit of a confrontation about the use of audiobooks, and it caused me a fair amount of anger. I got kind of riled up about it. And so I began sharing some information and researching some information to share with the people who thought that an audiobook was not an appropriate choice. So I have some of those articles kind of laid out before me, and I kind of want to go over why I think it's important to consider audiobooks just as valid and just as real as print books. Okay, so it's kind of ridiculous that we're still debating this in the year 2019. When I started researching, it seems that about the year 1996, so when I was still in high school, and now my kids are like getting to high school age, several articles were written in 1996. So I do have one of those talking about whether audiobooks could be used for more than struggling readers and English language learners. So those were the two categories that by 96 it was pretty acceptable to say, hey, besides people with visual impairment. Like obviously those were the first people who kind of had audiobooks. And I do have an article that kind of covers a lot of that information too. But in about 96, there was this, hey, we need to start researching whether average and gifted kids using audiobooks is a good idea or not. So the first article I have is one from 1996, and it's called Listening and Literacy Audiobooks in the Reading Program. And I will link all of these articles below in the description box. And this was from Reading Horizons, which appears to be some sort of journal. I don't know a whole lot about it. But the two authors are from the University of New Orleans, as of, October 1st of 1996. So it's been a while. So basically, they're saying in this article all of the good things that can come from audiobook use. So they do cover things like English language learners can comprehend more in an audio form without having to worry about decoding quite as much. It does talk about ADD students, things like that. But there are just 2 points that I kind of highlighted as falling in kind of my argument here, that audiobooks are good for any age, at any time, and for any reason, that you shouldn't have to have some sort of excuse for using an audiobook. So, one of the concerns that comes up a lot with audiobook usage is that people are afraid kids in particular won't read if they listen to audiobooks because audiobooks are easier, I guess. I don't know. Audiobooks take hours. Reading for me doesn't take that long. So audiobooks actually are a lot harder for me personally. But there are some people that it might be opposite for. So they point out that the adult pattern with audiobooks is the most avid readers of printed text will also be the most enthusiastic listeners in general. So they say if the youngsters' patterns duplicate that, then that would mean that those children who love reading are also going to love listening. So it's not that it's going to tear them away from books entirely. It's just going to be another format that they can enjoy. And further, youngsters, if they follow that adult pattern again, are likely to listen to works that they would not choose to read. So this is very true for me as an adult. There are some books that I am less likely to choose to read. A good one for this is Dickens. I don't really like reading Dickens, but I do enjoy listening to audiobook versions of Dickens. So that's an example of a book that I would not choose to read in a print format, but I would choose to read in an audiobook format. And then the other thing I marked in this particular article, because this is just my own personal argument involving my own personal children, is that they pointed out there can be important benefits for gifted readers. So oftentimes the kind of sentiment you get is, but you're a good enough reader, you don't need an audiobook. And that bugs me to no end. Okay, it's going to be a little bit of a rant video. I'm really sorry. Still kind of worked up. It says that gifted children can also benefit from audiobooks because even competent readers can sometimes not experience literature. And if we go back to Dickens, that's a good example, because even competent readers can't necessarily read the written dialect and hear it the way it should be heard. So if you are not British, raise your hand, and you're reading Dickens, and Dickens has dialect from different regions, it's going to be hard for you without that experience of that language in your ears to get that dialect correct. Same thing for some of the American classics. Like, I personally won't read aloud Mark Twain. I can't do Tom Sawyer. I can't do Huckleberry Finn because I cannot do the dialect. So those are the sorts of things that I would encourage my kids to reach for audiobooks for in particular. Plus, they can just pick an audiobook because it sounds good to them. That's fine with me. So the next article that I have to share is one about the past, present, and future of audiobooks. This particular article is written by an author who has a visual impairment, and that's how he started into audiobooks. So back in the 1990s, he got connected with the National Library Service, which produces audiobooks for the visually impaired. And they were the source of audiobooks. Some really cool things in here is it turns out that they had pretty much permission to produce any book that was needed. And so some audiobooks that he was able to listen to through this library to this date have not been done in an audiobook form for the general public. So, that's kind of crazy when you think about it, considering how many audiobooks there are now. But, back in the 90s, we were talking cassette tapes. And then we moved into CDs. And then once we get to digital downloads, audiobooks kind of explode because the format makes it more cost efficient, because buying a book on tape was a lot of money. Buying books on CDs cost a lot of money. I have quite a few up there. They were not cheap. But with the digital download, it's so much less expensive because you don't have all the manufacturing costs and everything. So it's kind of cool to think about how much more accessible audiobooks are now. So the first thing I really loved in this article is that he points out that the National Library Service's motto that's on their homepage is that all may read. And so access to books is such a huge thing. And I struggle when people are shamed for using audiobooks because it's such an ableist perspective. Not everyone can physically read a book. Even if somebody is blind and can read Braille, the access to Braille books is not very high, particularly if you live in the boonies like me. I don't think our library has a single book in Braille. I may ask sometime. But, it's just the access. Audiobooks are accessible to so many people. Now, obviously, audiobooks are not accessible to the deaf, so it's not going to be a perfect solution for everybody, but I don't understand why we have to be snobbish about print books over audiobooks. Okay, moving on. This one had so much history of audiobooks that was really interesting, but not a lot of things to really point out. So if you're interested in the history of audiobooks, I really recommend the second article, which is titled Audiobooks, the Past, the Present, the Future, Another Way to Read by James Tate Hill. And this one was published in May of this year. Okay, so a couple things that this author points out are that many readers of audiobooks are people who have genuinely wanted to read but haven't been able to find the time to sit down with a book. And I find this to be very true for a lot of people. My husband, he does read, but there's a lot of times a year where he doesn't have a lot of time where he can sit down and read, but he drives all day long, so he can listen to an audiobook all day long if he wants to. Another thing that he points out is that audiobook readers are not cannibalizing the audience for print. It's bringing in new people who wouldn't be reading if it weren't for audiobooks. Not saying that there's not overlap in people who listen to audiobooks and read print books. I mean, there's plenty of us who do both. But it's also bringing in people who weren't normally readers by having it be more accessible and more able to do in a variety of places. Like, if you drive for a commute, you can't read a book. If you're taking a train or something, you can. But if you drive, can't read a physical copy of a book, but you can listen to an audiobook. He also points out that most public libraries are now allowing patrons to check out digital audiobooks, as well as ebooks, and that's another way they can evolve and adapt the needs of the community. And our local library did recently join a digital cooperative library thing where we now can check out digital audiobooks and ebooks. Okay, the biggest piece that I got from this particular article is what do people get out of the distinction of to read? Like, if you say to read means to physically read with your eyeballs, what are you gaining from that definition? So, when I talk about audiobooks, I will sometimes say I listen to, but I consider them having been read. So I read those books. I read them with my ears rather than my eyes, but I read them. And kind of the way this author phrases this is, to those who are protective of the verb to read, I ask what is gained by insisting on the distinction. If a quarterback can read a defense and a computer can read a file, it doesn't seem like a leap to call 10 to 20 hours of processing words that happen to enter our brains through the ears reading. So I think that's kind of the best point he has, and he ends like, the point of reading is enjoyment and you're enjoying it, why is there a big deal? And that's kind of where I am falling on this, because we were told in the context of something that's supposed to be about reading enjoyment that an audiobook was not good enough. We've got, Is Listening to the Book the Same Thing as Reading It by Daniel T. Willingham, who is a psychologist at the University of Virginia, and he's a reading researcher. So he starts basically saying, a few years ago, when people found out I was a reading researcher, they would ask me how to help their dyslexic kid or how to get their kid to read more. But now the question that gets asked most often is it cheating if I listen to the audiobook for my book club? And I think that it's kind of that particular generation, the book club generation, that is fueling the fact that we're still having this argument in 2019. So, he talks about the different ways how reading and listening are different and how they are the same, and that one is not better than the other. So, obviously, when you read with your eyeballs, you are decoding. So, you have to decode the words. And when you read with your ears, you are listening. So, you don't have to do that decoding. Now, he points out that might be a problem for people who do not decode yet. But usually by about 5th grade, people decode well enough that it's not any extra work to decode the words when reading. And he points out that by high school, it's basically automatic, and it has no more effort or error than listening. Like listening and reading, you have the same kind of error rate in both. So what audiobooks have that physical books don't have is they have prosody, I believe is how you would say that. So it's basically the pitch, tempo, and stress of spoken words. So you have to guess at this when you're reading a book. But when you have an audiobook, if it's well done, I have heard some badly done audiobooks, and I don't recommend badly done audiobooks, but if you have an audiobook, it gives you that. So you know how it's supposed to sound. An example he uses is from Romeo and Juliet, when Juliet says, "Wherefore art thou, Romeo?" If you were reading that, you might think that the stress goes on art. "Wherefore art thou, Romeo?" More asking where Romeo is. But if the stress on like listening in the proper way, in a performance, it would actually be a stress on Romeo. "Wherefore art thou, Romeo?" So she's actually pondering his name, not wondering about where he's located. So that makes a big difference in comprehension if you have that given to you. Now, it's not saying that it's not good to learn how to interpret that yourself, but an audiobook might be a great option for books where you might have more difficulty with that. So some of the things that he talks about are with harder level text and with scientific information and things like that. People who listen to a podcast versus reading the same thing. The readers did slightly better on a quiz 2 days later. But he kind of points out that that's highly technical information, and with the print, it's easier to go back and forth. And that's not as easy to do in audiobooks yet, but that doesn't mean that there won't be the technology for that sometime in the future. It's just we're not quite there yet. So he basically says that print is better for lingering over ideas, and I find this to be true in a lot of ways. Most of the time, I prefer my nonfiction in print. Although if the nonfiction is read by the author, sometimes I think the audiobook is a better option. So print is better for lingering over all those ideas, but listening is better for just being able to find the time, because you can listen while you do other things. I like to listen while I fold laundry, or I like to listen while I drive. I can't read when I'm driving, and I can't read if somebody else is driving. I get car sick. So I do a lot of audiobooks in the car. So he suggests that our richest experience would come from treating print sources and audio sources interchangeably, noting that there are some differences, but that one is not clearly better than the other. And I think a lot of times we have people who think that print versions are superior to audio versions. So that's kind of what I'm fighting against. This article is from August 10th, 2016. To your brain, listening to a book is pretty much the same as reading it. It's by Melissa Dahl. So let's get into this one. She begins with a little anecdote about her book club and how one of the ladies admitted that she listened to the audiobook and was shamed so badly that she never admitted to it again. Now, that's not to say she didn't use an audiobook again, it's just that she wasn't willing to say it to her nosy book club people who were judging her. I don't know for sure. I'm guessing she probably continued to listen to audiobooks, but who knows? Basically, this one goes into an argument against that listening is cheating. So basically, if we have the assertion that listening is cheating, we're saying that the listener got some sort of reward without putting in the work. They're not actually working. They didn't do it right. I ran into this when I asked for suggestions on articles about audiobooks in a book group I'm a part of on Facebook. And somebody attacked me and said that my kid was cheating because she wasn't working as hard as the other kids if she listened to an audiobook, which is asinine. Asinine. So I just ended up deleting that whole thing, and whatever. She can go live her happy little life with no audiobooks. Basically, she points to David Willingham, the author of another one of these articles. He argues that to your brain, listening is less work than reading, but only to about 5th grade. So we're past 5th grade now. No longer a good argument. And there have been quite a few research studies done about comprehension. And generally speaking, all of these studies show very similar levels of reading comprehension and listening comprehension. So there is a study in 77 and a study in 85 that both show this. So it's been across the decades. So another big argument that people have against audiobooks is you might be multitasking if you're listening to an audiobook, and so you might miss something. You might not be paying attention all of the time, and you'll miss stuff, and so it's not the same thing. But Willingham, the guy who wrote the other article, has said that about 10 to 20% of your eye movements when reading are actually regressions. They're going back because you either didn't get it or you're trying to figure out the syntax or something. I find myself doing this a lot. I can read an entire page, get to the bottom of the page, and be like, I have no idea what I just read. And I'm sure I cannot be alone in that. So the fact that you can space out during a book as well as an audiobook makes it so this argument that you may miss something in an audiobook seems less important, particularly now with the advent of this skip back 30-second button on like Audible. I think most of them have some sort of 15-second, 30-second, so you can quickly go back if you need to. And I do use those buttons. It's a lot easier than back in the day when you had to rewind your cassette tape. So, since we have this, like, our eyes go backwards quite a bit, he also points out that we do this when we listen, too. So, when somebody's talking to you and you're not really listening and they get to the end and it's clear that they just asked you a question, but you don't know what it was, and you're like, I'm sorry, what did you just say? And then before they can answer, as soon as you get that done, you're like, oh, yeah, I can answer that, because it's actually called echoic memory. So you just kind of, it's floating around there in your brain and you weren't really paying attention, but you can go back and kind of catch it. So that helps in audiobooks, just like the ability to just skip back and scan works in a book. I think deep down, what bothers me most about this kind of philosophy that audiobooks are somehow cheating is that we're reducing it to the book it philosophy of reading. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't dislike book it. My girls don't participate anymore. I think they're both too old now. We did them when they were little. And basically this is like the elementary school star chart philosophy. Like, you have to read X number of books and you get stars and you get prizes and whatever. So if you are treating reading as some sort of major achievement, like, oh, I read a book, then that's what's feeding into this. Like, we're not in the book it program now. Does it really matter if you read a physical book and I listened to an audiobook? We could still talk about what happened if you read the physical and I listened to an audiobook, we'd both know the characters, we'd know the setting, we'd know the plot, we'd be able to discuss the ideas in it. But this idea that the person who physically read it gets more credit, I think kind of goes back to all of those reading rewards sorts of things in school. So, I am a firm believer that audiobooks are as good as, and sometimes even better than, physical books. If you have an opinion on this and would like to share it in the comments, feel free. I'm probably not going to agree with you if you tell me that audiobooks are cheating. I'm pretty evangelical in my love of audiobooks, but you're welcome to tell me about it in the comments. And particularly if you have good research studies that prove that real books are better. I don't think they're out there, but if you can find something, we'll see what it says. If you like videos about audiobooks or discussions about topics in reading, go ahead and like this video. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you would like to see more of my videos and hopefully some videos with the girls eventually. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.